The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, like a confession, like everything Andrea Taylor had been too afraid to say for months. "I'm not wearing anything under this," Barbara Green whispered, her fingers playing with the hem of her oversized sweater as she settled onto the couch beside Andrea, close enough that their thighs touched through the soft fabric of their pajama pants. Andrea's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to process what Barbara had just said, what it meant, what it could mean. The living room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker, charged with an electricity that made her skin tingle where Barbara's arm brushed against hers. Barbara," Andrea breathed, turning to face her fully, searching those familiar green eyes for answers to questions she'd been too terrified to ask. "What are you saying?" Barbara's cheeks flushed pink in the lamplight, but she didn't look away, didn't retreat. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I'm saying I can't pretend anymore. I'm saying I've been thinking about you, about us, about what it would feel like if I just—" Her words trailed off as her gaze dropped to Andrea's lips, lingering there with an intensity that made Andrea's entire world tilt on its axis. "If you just what?" Andrea asked, her own voice barely audible, her hands trembling as she reached up to cup Barbara's face, thumbs brushing across those flushed cheekbones. "Pristiars." "If I just kissed you," Barbara confessed, her eyes fluttering closed as she leaned into Andrea's touch. "I've wanted to for so long, Andrea. I've been such an idiot, such a coward, but I can't keep lying to myself about what I feel for you." The confession hit Andrea like a wave, washing over her with relief and joy, and a love so fierce it took her breath away. "Then kiss me," she whispered, her forehead coming to rest against Barbara's, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "Please, Barbara, just kiss me." Puffer, but to understand how they arrived at this moment, this perfect collision of confession and desire, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, when Andrea Taylor first realized she was completely and hopelessly in love with her best friend. 3 months earlier, Andrea had been curled up in the corner of this same couch, watching Barbara pace back and forth across their shared apartment's living room, her phone pressed to her ear as she argued with her boyfriend Christopher Rodriguez about something trivial and forgettable. Andrea had been trying to focus on her book, but her attention kept drifting to the way Barbara's hair caught the afternoon light streaming through their windows, the way her free hand gestured emphatically as she spoke, the way her voice took on that particular edge it always got when Christopher was being particularly obtuse. "No, Chris, that's not what I said at all," Barbara was saying, her frustration evident in every line of her body. "I said I needed space to think, not that I wanted to break up. There's a difference." And Andrea had felt that familiar twist in her chest, the one that always came when Barbara talked about her relationship troubles, the one she'd been trying to ignore for months now. She'd told herself it was just concern for her friend, just the natural worry that came with watching someone you cared about struggle with an incompatible partner. But deep down, in the part of herself she was too afraid to examine too closely, she knew it was something else entirely. It was jealousy, pure and simple, though she'd never been able to admit it to herself until that afternoon, when Barbara finally hung up the phone and collapsed onto the couch beside her with a heavy sigh. "I don't understand him sometimes," Barbara had said, running her hands through her hair in frustration. "It's like we're speaking completely different languages. I try to explain what I need, what I'm feeling, and he doesn't get it." Andrea had set her book aside, turning to face Barbara fully, her heart aching at the defeated expression on her friend's face. "What did you tell him you needed?" she'd asked gently, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Space," Barbara had replied, her voice quiet and tired. "Time to figure out what I actually want from a relationship, because whatever Chris and I have, it's not it. It's not what I thought love was supposed to feel like." That had been the moment, Andrea realized now, when everything changed. Not just because of what Barbara had said, but because of the way she'd looked at Andrea when she said it, like she was searching for something in Andrea's face, some kind of answer or understanding that she couldn't find anywhere else. "What do you think love is supposed to feel like?" Andrea had asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them, before she could consider the dangerous territory they were entering. Barbara had been quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant and thoughtful. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost reverent. "Like coming home," she'd said, "like finding someone who sees all of you, even the messy parts, and chooses to stay anyway. Like feeling safe enough to be completely yourself without having to perform or pretend or hold back pieces of who you are." Parsers Andrea's heart had clenched at those words, because they described exactly how she felt when she was with Barbara, exactly what their friendship had always been for her. But before she could respond, before she could even begin to process the implications of what Barbara had just said, Barbara was continuing. "With Chris, I feel like I'm always acting," she'd confessed, her fingers absently playing with the throw pillow in her lap. "Like I'm playing the role of the girlfriend he wants me to be, instead of just being myself. And I'm tired of it, Andrea. I'm tired of feeling like I have to be someone else to be loved." The vulnerability in Barbara's voice had broken something open in Andrea's chest, and she'd found herself reaching out without thinking, covering Barbara's hand with her own. The contact had sent a jolt of electricity up her arm, and she'd seen Barbara's eyes widen slightly at the touch, saw something shift in her expression that Andrea hadn't been able to name at the time. "Parte. You never have to be anyone but yourself with me," Andrea had said, the words carrying more weight than she'd intended, more truth than she'd been ready to acknowledge. "You know that, right?" Barbara had stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in her green eyes before she'd squeezed Andrea's hand gently. "I know," she'd whispered. "That's what makes this so confusing." Andrea had wanted to ask what she meant by that, wanted to push and probe and understand what was happening in the space between them, but before she could find the courage, Barbara's phone had buzzed with another call from Christopher, and the moment had been lost. But that conversation had planted a seed, had opened a door that neither of them seemed able to close again. Over the following weeks, their interactions had taken on a new quality, a heightened awareness that made every casual touch feel charged with meaning, every shared glance feel heavy with possibility. Barbara had started seeking out Andrea's company more deliberately, finding excuses to curl up next to her on the couch during their evening movie nights, letting their shoulders brush as they cooked dinner together, lingering in doorways when Andrea was getting ready for bed, as if she was reluctant to let the day end. T-prom. And Andrea, for her part, had found herself hyper-aware of every one of these moments, cataloging them like precious treasures, while simultaneously trying to convince herself that she was reading too much into perfectly innocent, friendly behavior. But it was getting harder to maintain that fiction, especially when Barbara started asking questions that seemed designed to probe the boundaries of their relationship. "Have you ever wondered what it would be like to kiss a woman?" Barbara had asked one evening about 6 weeks after that first conversation, the question coming out of nowhere as they shared a bottle of wine and watched the sunset from their apartment's small balcony. "Pervert." Andrea had nearly choked on her wine, her heart racing as she tried to formulate a response that wouldn't give away everything she'd been trying to hide. What brought that on?" she'd managed, buying herself time while her mind reeled. Barbara had shrugged, but there was something studied about her casual tone, something that made Andrea think the question wasn't as random as it seemed. "I don't know. I was just thinking about how different it might be, you know? Softer, maybe. More intuitive." The way Barbara had said the word softer had sent heat pooling low in Andrea's belly, and she'd had to grip her wine glass tighter to keep her hands from shaking. "Have you?" she'd asked, turning the question back on Barbara because she wasn't sure she could trust her own voice to say anything else. "Wondered?" Barbara had asked, and when Andrea nodded, she'd been quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness. "Yeah," she'd finally admitted, so quietly Andrea had to strain to hear her. "Yeah, I have." The admission had hung between them like a bridge neither of them was quite ready to cross, but its presence had changed everything. From that night forward, there had been an undercurrent of tension in all their interactions, a sense of standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying and wonderful. Barbara had broken up with Christopher 2 weeks later, citing the same incompatibilities she'd been complaining about for months, but Andrea had sensed there was more to it than that. The way Barbara had looked at her when she'd announced the breakup, the way her eyes had searched Andrea's face as if looking for some specific reaction, had suggested that her decision had been about more than just her relationship with Christopher. "So, I feel like I can breathe again," Barbara had said that night, curled up next to Andrea on the couch with a cup of tea warming her hands. "Like I've been holding my breath for months and I finally remembered how to exhale." Andrea had wanted to ask what that meant, wanted to understand what had really driven Barbara's decision, but she'd been too afraid of the answer, too terrified that pushing for clarity would shatter whatever delicate thing was building between them. Instead, she'd simply held Barbara as she cried tears that seemed equal parts relief and confusion, had stroked her hair and whispered reassurances while her own heart hammered with a mixture of hope and terror that she couldn't quite name. The weeks following Barbara's breakup had been a study in careful navigation, both of them seeming to sense that they were walking through a minefield of possibility and potential heartbreak. Their physical contact had become more frequent, but also more tentative, as if they were both testing boundaries while simultaneously being afraid to cross them. Barbara had started sleeping in Andrea's bed on the nights when her anxiety was particularly bad, claiming that she slept better with company, and Andrea had been powerless to refuse, even though having Barbara's warm body pressed against hers through the thin fabric of their pajamas was a special kind of exquisite torture. Those nights had been filled with whispered conversations in the dark, confessions and questions that somehow felt safer to voice when they couldn't see each other's faces clearly. Barbara had talked about feeling lost, about not knowing who she was outside of her relationship with Christopher, about feeling like she'd been living someone else's life for so long that she'd forgotten what her own desires actually were. And Andrea had listened, offering comfort and support while her own heart ached with the knowledge that she was falling deeper in love with Barbara with every passing day, every shared secret, every moment of vulnerability that Barbara chose to share with her instead of anyone else. "Sometimes I feel like I'm just going through the motions," Barbara had whispered one particularly difficult night, her face pressed against Andrea's shoulder as they lay tangled together in the darkness. "Like I've been so focused on being what everyone else wanted me to be that I forgot how to want anything for myself." "What do you want?" Andrea had asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. Barbara had been silent for so long that Andrea had thought she'd fallen asleep, but then she'd felt Barbara's fingers find hers beneath the covers, their hands linking together with a naturalness that made Andrea's breath catch. "I want to feel like myself again," Barbara had finally whispered. "I want to stop being afraid of what I might discover if I really looked at what I want instead of what I think I should want." The conversation had ended there, but Andrea had lain awake for hours afterward, Barbara's words echoing in her mind and her heart racing with the possibilities they seemed to suggest. Because if Barbara was questioning what she wanted, if she was ready to stop living according to other people's expectations, then maybe, just maybe, there was room in that exploration for Andrea. The shift had become more pronounced after that night, Barbara's behavior growing bolder, more deliberate in ways that Andrea couldn't ignore even as she tried to protect herself from the possibility of misinterpretation. Barbara had started finding excuses to touch her more often, her hands lingering on Andrea's arms or shoulders when she passed behind her in the kitchen, her fingers brushing against Andrea's when they reached for the same thing. She'd also started paying attention to Andrea in ways that felt different, more intense, her gaze following Andrea around their apartment with a focus that made Andrea's skin tingle with awareness. Sometimes Andrea would look up from her book or her laptop to find Barbara watching her with an expression that was soft and wondering, and something else that Andrea was afraid to name. "Pracho, "You have beautiful hands," Barbara had said one evening, the comment coming out of nowhere as they sat at their kitchen table sharing takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant. Poor Andrea had looked down at her hands, confused by the observation and by the way Barbara was staring at them with such intensity. Thank you," she'd replied, unsure how to respond to such an unexpected compliment. Parat. "I've always thought so," Barbara had continued, reaching across the table to trace one finger along the back of Andrea's hand, following the line of her knuckles with a touch so light it was barely there. "They're elegant, graceful. I love watching you use them when you're cooking or reading or just existing." The touch and the words had sent heat racing through Andrea's veins, and she'd had to fight the urge to turn her hand over and capture Barbara's fingers with her own. Instead, she'd sat frozen, afraid to move or speak or do anything that might break the spell of the moment. "Potty, Barbara," she'd whispered, not sure what she was asking or what she wanted to say, just knowing that her friend's name felt like a prayer on her lips. But Barbara had pulled her hand back then, seeming to realize what she'd been doing, and the rest of the evening had passed in a haze of careful politeness that had left Andrea more confused and frustrated than ever. These moments had been accumulating like storm clouds, building pressure and tension, until Andrea felt like she was walking around with her nerves exposed, every interaction with Barbara feeling charged with significance and possibility. She'd started to wonder if she was losing her mind, if her own feelings were causing her to read meaning into innocent gestures and casual comments. But then had come the night that changed everything, the night when all of Barbara's careful probing and Andrea's desperate hoping had finally collided in a moment of truth that neither of them could take back. It had started like so many of their recent evenings, with both of them curled up on opposite ends of their couch, Andrea reading while Barbara scrolled through her phone. But there had been something different in the air that night, a restless energy that had both of them shifting and fidgeting, unable to settle into their usual comfortable routine. "Pari!" "Andrea?" Barbara had said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet of their living room with an urgency that made Andrea look up from her book immediately. "Quote, yeah, quote, question mark," Andrea had replied, setting her book aside and giving Barbara her full attention, something in her friend's tone alerting her that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation. Barbara had been quiet for a moment, seeming to gather her courage, and when she finally spoke, her words had hit Andrea like a physical blow. "I think I'm in love with you." The confession had hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable and terrifying in its honesty, and Andrea had felt her entire world rearrange itself around those 6 simple words. Everything she'd been hoping for, everything she'd been too afraid to believe could be real, was suddenly right there in front of her, offered freely and without reservation. "I know it's crazy," Barbara had continued, the words tumbling out of her in a rush now that the dam had been broken. "I know it changes everything, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I can't keep pretending anymore. I can't keep lying to myself about what I feel for you. Besta Kars." Andrea had stared at her, speechless with shock and joy, and a love so overwhelming it threatened to drown her, and Barbara had taken her silence as rejection, her face crumpling with disappointment and hurt. "I'm sorry," Barbara had whispered, starting to pull back, to retreat into herself the way she always did when she felt vulnerable and exposed. "I shouldn't have said anything. I should have just—" But Andrea hadn't let her finish, hadn't been able to let Barbara believe for even one more second that her feelings weren't returned with every fiber of Andrea's being. She'd launched herself across the couch, capturing Barbara's face in her hands and cutting off her apology with a kiss that was desperate and hungry and full of 3 months' worth of suppressed longing. Paf. Barbara had frozen for a moment, clearly shocked by Andrea's response, but then she'd melted into the kiss with a soft sound of relief and desire that had made Andrea's heart soar. They'd kissed like they were drowning and each other was air, like they were trying to make up for all the time they'd wasted dancing around their feelings, like they were finally home. When they'd finally broken apart, both breathing heavily and staring at each other with wonder, Andrea had pressed her forehead against Barbara's and whispered the words she'd been carrying in her heart for months. I love you too. God, Barbara, I love you so much it terrifies me. And that had brought them to now, to this moment of perfect honesty and vulnerability, with Barbara's confession hanging in the air between them like a promise of everything they could be together. "Then kiss me," Andrea whispered again, her thumbs brushing across Barbara's cheekbones as she held her face gently, reverently, like she was holding something precious and fragile and infinitely valuable. As Barbara's eyes fluttered open, meeting Andrea's gaze with a mixture of love and desire and nervous anticipation that made Andrea's heart skip a beat. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely audible, her hands coming up to rest on Andrea's wrists. "Terraverse." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Andrea replied, and it was true. Despite all the uncertainty and fear and confusion of the past few months, this moment felt inevitable, felt right in a way that made every doubt and worry fade into insignificance. Farm Barbara smiled then, a radiant expression that transformed her entire face and made Andrea fall in love with her all over again. "I'm not wearing anything under this," she repeated, her voice stronger now, more confident, and Andrea realized that it hadn't just been a statement of fact, but a declaration of trust, of vulnerability, of readiness to be completely open and honest with Andrea in every possible way. "Nidarizo, I know," Andrea whispered, leaning closer until their lips were barely a breath apart. "I love you, Barbara Green. I love you exactly as you are." And then they were kissing again, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Andrea knew that whatever came next, whatever challenges they might face as they navigated this new reality together, they would figure it out. Because this perfect moment of connection and understanding and love was worth everything.